Hello, everyone. We're starting a little late, just at our usual time, 15 minutes late. I hope it's not a problem for everyone. I just wanted to say it's a real joy to have you all here in this room. My name is Mila Burns. I'm the Associate Director at the CLACOS, the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies here at the Graduate Center. For those who are not familiar with the CLACOS, we have a bunch of amazing events throughout the year. This is just one example of those. We're also a center that aims to support visiting scholars and people interested in Latin American Latino studies in general in this building, current students, alumni, you name it. As long as you have a passion for Latin American Latino studies, you're welcome at the CLACOS. That was the case with Fellipe, who approached me maybe 2 months ago, Fellipe, about his research, and we had no idea how we could collaborate. And we were just like, we have to do something. This is such a fascinating topic. We have to do something together. So the CLACOS is here for that as an open place. If you need a desk, if you need a place to do a meeting, if you want to have cookies with us, if you want to share ideas and you know, whatever, as I said, this is a place for our community here at the Graduate Center. So we also have the Latino Data Project, which is a production of quantitative, mostly research on Latinos in this country. So for those of you who don't know it, please Google, check on our website. It's really cool. We also have our social media, so you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, so that you can keep updated with our events and everything that's going on with us. When Fellipe approached me, Professor Fellipe Coelho-Lima approached me about his research, I was immediately engaged and thinking that we should do something, as I mentioned before, especially because for me, this seemed like a very urgent topic, but at the same time, it had that feeling of a big thing because it's so new. And at the same time, it felt just like labor issues, as always, as we always see them in history, like exploitation or something that starts as looking like a very good idea. And you're like, wow, we're destroying the taxis, the mafia in the New York and medallions and all that. And a few months later, we're like, well, this is just precarious work. That's weird. Where do I stand here? And I don't know enough about this topic. So for me, it was really an opportunity to get to know such an urgent issue and what for me felt like the labor issue of our time. So I really appreciate you approaching us and really appreciate you all here putting this event together. So I'll briefly introduce our panelists. We have here Andrew Wolf, who is currently a research fellow at the Workplace Justice Lab at Rutgers University School of Management and Labor Relations. He teaches at the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies. He studies how the labor movement and governments are responding to the gig economy, with a focus on the impacts of app-based employment for immigrant populations. His research helped inform the New York City Council on legislation to provide minimum employment standards for app delivery workers and has been featured in the New York Times, NPR, Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, and New York Magazine. Fellipe Coelho-Lima is a professor at the Psychology Department of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte in Brazil. His research and teaching activities are developed with a focus on the effects of the new precarious forms of work in the lives of workers and the ways they resist. Currently, he has been working on the topic of work on digital platforms and the ideology of work. He coordinates the international research Nexus of Uberization and analysis from the worker's perspective. Each one will make a brief presentation, and then distinguished Professor Ruth Milkman will make comments. For those of you who are new to this building and for some crazy reason have not heard of her brilliant and prolific career, Professor Ruth Milkman is a distinguished professor of sociology and history at the CUNY Graduate Center and Labor Studies Chair at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. She's the author of many books, many works, including most recently Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat, published in 2020. The event, by the way, is co-sponsored by the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and we are broadcasting it live. So thank you all again for coming. Thank you all for watching us. And with now I'm gonna invite Andrew Wolf, Professor Wolf, to make his presentation. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much. I have been researching app workers for about 4 years now, and I actually started when I started organizing, researching with the workers. I was mainly focused on the Uber drivers, and I actually had kind of decided to look at delivery as like a null case because there was no worker organizing, right? And then the pandemic happened, and you had this massive um, takeoff of the Los Deliveristas Unidos movement. So it was kind of like an interesting thing. So part of my research originally was, why is there no organizing in the delivery? And then it actually took off. So no worries. There we go. So what I'm going to focus on today is when the Deliveristas started organizing. I reached out to them to learn more and see if we could collaborate. And I ended up working with them and some folks at the Cornell Worker Institute here in the city on a large survey that was used by the city in the initial hearings to pass the legislation to establish a minimum wage. So I was going to walk through a bit from my survey with Cornell, and then the city's more recent survey as well. And then I'll talk a bit about the Deliveristas movement.
Good before. What happened? There we go. That's good.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. So you see here, this is the this was the massive movement last fall. I think that was one of the things that was so amazing about the Deliveristas movement was every time they would call for a protest, they thought a few hundred people would show up maybe. And this last one, there was 10,000 or so people who showed up. So the numbers were pretty impressive. How do I?
I'm so sorry. I don't know. Can't you just use the arrows on the?
Oh, it was frozen. Okay.
Yeah. There we go.
Okay.
You can just press here.
Okay, great, thank you. Great, so I'll go through a little bit of the background, and then first I'll go into a little bit of background on the industry and what it's like working the apps. Then I'll talk a bit from our survey results before talking about what's happening currently with the Deliveristas. So this is from the one of the important things that happened with the passage of the city's new regulations was greater data collection. So this is, for gig researchers generally, this is the first time we're getting some of this information. So you see here, and I found this in my research as well, even though unsurprisingly, the work really is concentrated in lower Manhattan, delivery is happening everywhere in the city. And so I think that's one of the first important things to note. In the outer boroughs, that's and especially further out in the outer boroughs, you'll see where people are doing it by cars, whereas in the more dense parts of the city, that's where people are doing it by e-bike. So what's it like to work these apps? So just to give you a bit of a sense of how the job works. So when you log on to the app, you're presented with orders, and this circle thing here. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't walk too much so the people online can hear. That okay, that circle is a countdown clock. So you essentially have 30 seconds to decide if you're going to accept an order or not. And I don't know if anyone else here is from Brooklyn, but so this picture is from Brooklyn. The map that is being presented to the worker right now is sideways. And this is the kind of way in which they don't give clear information about what's going to happen, because if it was straight, the worker would more clearly gauge that this is a massive amount of distance that's going to be covered. This order would take probably about an hour, and you'd only be making 5:30 right for the order. So the workers have to decide if they're going to accept it or not. If they don't click, it automatically accepts it for them and gets put in their queue. And so then when you go to the restaurants, you are presented with what you need to pick up. So here the worker has to pick up 2 orders, blacked out the names, but 2 different orders from this Wendy's in Brooklyn. And it gives you a list of what's supposed to be in the order, and the worker is instructed that they're supposed to check to make sure that this happens. Then you take the order and go to the worker's house. So I think, especially thinking in the Marxist tradition, there's really two ways you can think about how control is administered. So the apps replace managers with algorithms, right? And the algorithms do two things. They create coercion and they create consent. And I think, though, it's important to note this because the coercive elements of it, I think, are often overlooked. They try to say that because the algorithms are neutral, this is why you have they're just independent contractors. It's small business owners making their own decisions. But the truth is that you are given very limited decisions. So here's an example. This is on the DoorDash app here on the left. The workers have to pick a zone to work, and they actually can only work in zones where it's currently open. So you see here, if the worker wanted to work in Manhattan, they can't. They have to work one of the further out areas in Brooklyn or Queens, right? The central cities where you're going to get the most orders, make the most money, is not currently available. The apps also make the workers sign up in advance for shifts. The shift priority is based off of how much you'd worked in the past 30 days, your rating, how quickly you'd worked. And so, for example, if you get injured and you don't work, it decreases your priority and rating, and you're going to have to, build that back up. And that priority impacts when you get to sign up for shifts. So if you don't work a lot, you don't really stand a chance of picking up shifts on a Friday night on the more lucrative apps, which is also why all the workers work multiple apps. A lot's been made about this notion of algorithmic management. So because there aren't managers, they need to use subtle signals to try to tell the workers where to work. So this is on the Uber app. So you see this worker is out in Brooklyn, but there's not as many orders there, so they're trying to push the worker towards downtown Brooklyn. So they'll surge price, and the worker will get an extra $3 per order if they go where the company wants them to go. So there's all these ways in which, even though they're claiming they're independent contractors, they're actually being clearly directed by the apps. The other thing that the apps do is appeal to workers' consenting to their own exploitation in this. And one of the main ways that they do this is through gamification. So here's an example on the left, or nope, right, of the Uber app. So each week, your Uber drivers, Uber delivery people are offered a quest for the week, and it's the potential weekly bonus if they hit the quest. And if they don't pick one, one's automatically assigned. And so this kind of gamifies workers to keep working, work longer than maybe they wanted to. And it also, importantly for the apps, it encourages the workers to keep working on one app and not travel to their competitor apps as well. And so I wanted to bring up this notion of algorithmic management, gamification, and how it creates a false autonomy, just to show the ways in which they've changed the way delivery is done, because they're no longer direct employees technically, but they've maintained many of these same features. So who are these delivery workers in New York? So and this is true for the rest of the slideshow, the charts in white are from the New York City's recent report and findings of their survey. The darker charts are from the survey that I did with the folks at Cornell. So basically, you should think of it as like us on the street talking to workers versus subpoena power. Okay, so the city's data is a little more accurate, but we asked some questions they didn't. So that's why I wanted to put. So they didn't. They just asked race the way the census does, where we broke it out a little bit more. So delivery workers are young, they're male, and they come from primarily immigrant populations. By far, the largest of these is Latinos, with the other big groups being South Asian, West African, and Chinese. And the other thing that our research found that this survey doesn't immediately show is not only are they from these immigrant communities, but in many of the cases, they're from marginal groups within that immigrant community. So a lot of the Latino workers, especially the original workers who organized the Deliveristas movement, are indigenous from Mexico and Guatemala. So Spanish is their second language, and often many of them don't, read it well, let alone English. Similarly, with the South Asians, most of them are Bangladeshi, and likewise with the Chinese, a lot of them are Fuganese from the Fujian province, which is often marginalized within the Chinese community in New York City. The other important finding from our study is that the majority of the workforce, especially when we did the survey, joined during COVID. So food delivery work became the occupation of last resort for immigrants during the pandemic. This is actually in part why the Deliveristas organized with the Workers' Justice Project. A lot of them were already part of the Workers' Justice Project, which I'll talk about in a bit, but had lost their construction or food service jobs when the pandemic started and moved over to delivery. And the city found the same results as us, but the dominant most of the workers work for either DoorDash, Uber Eats, or Grubhub. And then a large number also work for Relay, which is a interesting company because it operates on a different business model than the others. It ferries food from warehouses to office buildings. So, like these Wall Street will offer free lunch to their workers. So it's like a centralized warehouse of getting the food to the workers in the city. Is it okay? Oh, okay. So this is from the city's report as well. And importantly and interestingly, this was a little different from our survey, where we were mainly surveying in Manhattan. And since they were able to use administrative data and survey anyone who was on these apps, I was surprised at actually how many people do use their car to do this work. We found almost no one was using their car, but that's not surprising given how we were doing our survey. So a large number of, but still most, and you see here though, the percentage, even though there are a lot of people who are in their cars, the people in their cars are not nearly doing the volume of orders. So 77% of deliveries are still happening by bike in the city. And then additionally, as you see, the vast majority, 77% of workers, this is their full and only job. And interestingly, it's the people who do it in their cars who do it more casually. In my own research with this, I experienced this as well. I would see a lot of like students, or especially the women tend to do who do this work tend to use cars instead of bikes because they feel it's safer. They'll often do it in pairs as well to provide that added safety. So this was the city's findings on pay. Interestingly, I was very surprised about this. The city found the workers were paid even less than we did, which I thought we assuredly were paying greater attention to expenses than they were. Although I'll show you in the next chart, it's because pay's decreased over the last year and a half. So this is net pay. So and it includes tips. So the net pay is before tips is only $44.44 an hour, and with tips it gets up to about $11.99.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I will read because I think it's more easy to not be confusing here. So, first, thank you for your attendance in this event. I'm very happy to be able to share this activity with Andrew, Bila, Ruth, and to count on the participation of all of you who are following along. In these next minutes, I will talk a little bit with you about the digital platform work scenario in Latin America. I have used as support for this some reflection that we have produced in the research Nexus of Uberization. It is a project that involves researchers from Brazil and Argentina, and that has sought to understand what the delivery workers think, feel, and act about their jobs, right? So the first point I would like to address is about the Latin America. Its constitution is marked by violence invasion by European people, mainly Portuguese and Spanish, but also Dutch, French, and other were responsible for the genocide of more than 50 million people from the original population of Latin America. Add to this is the plunder of the natural resource of this region, such as gold, silver, and wood, as well as the terrible history of enslavement of the regional peoples and the abduction of Africans from their continents. Brazil was the last country in the West to abolish formal slavery. This contributes to the fact that European countries were able to organize their industries, but it also creates social relations in Latin America countries that prevent their independence development. As Rudmar Marini pointed out, these countries entered later in the global dynamic of capitalism, and they did so in an unequal way due to the lack of capital retained or in the former colonies. Soon the boundaries of the dependency and the subordination were updated. One of the characteristics of this situation is that the national bourgeoisie also submits to the international bourgeoisie, given the alliance based on loans and debt. Therefore, the Latin American working class is doubly exploited. They need to produce surplus value for the national and the international bourgeoisie at the same time. As named by Marini, this class becomes super exploited. In this process, workers are subjected to the more intensive and extensive forms of labor. Moreover, the remuneration of their labor is necessarily lower than what is necessary for their survival. Two consequences of this situation are important in understanding the rise of digital platform work in Latin America. One of that, given the lower than necessary remuneration, this class is subjected to a latent hunger. As a way out, it is typical of this class in this region to constantly search for new jobs or to supplement income through small service. The second consequence is that the typical informality of labor relation in Latin America is necessary for the maintenance of this superexploitation. Authors such as Francisco de Oliveira, Milton Santos, and Lélia Gonzalez have pointed out how the informal circuit is necessary to sustain the formal circuit of the economy. This is because it provides cheaper services and products that allow the maintenance of the salaried parts of the working class. Therefore, Latin Americans' average rates of the 40 to 50% informality is functional for the set of global capitalism relation. This superexploitation is superimposed on the sexual and the racial division of labor. In the 80s, Lélia Gonzalez pointed out that racism and the chauvinism legitimized within Latin American society the existence of a group that historically engaged in the most precarious form of work. It is in this context that work mediated by digital platforms arrives in this region of work. Giving of small services, gigs, or in Portuguese, bicos, without the protection of the laws or eventually regulation of labor was already common in Latin America, as well as low wages, dangerous work contexts, and a class that constantly search for new sources of income. Thus, when digital platform and the digital labor platforms arrives in Latin America, they already find well-established informal and the precarious labor relations, a situation quite different from its place of origin in the global north. Moreover, it's appropriated this dynamic of established this regulation and a working class that was historically experienced informality and a lack of access to rights, especially when it comes to young Black people who have historically been the most informal workers and who are currently the workforce based for many of the digital platforms like delivery workers. Oh, here. Turning now more specifically to digital platforms working in Latin America, we have some important differentiations from compared to New York or the other cities in the global north. According to the latest International Labour Organization report, in this region, the main type of platform companies are delivery and the transport. They started to gain space in the last decade and have grown 14 times this period. According to the Development Bank of Latin America, about 90.4% of Latin American workers have worked through a digital platform at least once, and it is rise to 16% if we consider those who have active profiles in some digital platform works. This number has been affected by the pandemic. Considering the Brazilian example, between 2016 and 2021, the growth was 37%, and today more than 1 million Brazilian workers are delivery workers or drivers on digital platforms. Okay. However, at the same time that this rapid growth has occurred, this type of work has also deteriorated. Continuing on the Brazilian scenarios, among the delivery workers, a report produced by Remy pointed out that in this type of work, working conditions have worsened. During the pandemic growth in 5%, the number of delivery workers that work more than 8 hours a day, reaching 61% of workers in this situation. Meanwhile, 60% reported a drop in pay over the same period. The latest report from Fair Work in Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and Argentina goes in the same direction. They look at the type of pay, contract, management, work representation, and the work condition among the 6 largest digital platform works companies in these countries. On a scale from 0 to 10, no company got more than 3 points. The international company had worse score than the local companies, as Uberization and the others. This show part of the scenarios of extreme precariousness that constitutes the work in digital platform in Latin America. Okay. This situation of worsening of insecurity during the pandemic was the trigger for a cycle of strikes among digital platform workers. One of the movements that drew most attention in this period were the 3 editions of the Paro Internacional de Partidores and the Break dos Apps. The first pick from the Paro Internacional and the last ones is the Break dos Apps. In 2020, on April 22nd, May 28th, and July 1st, delivery workers from Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Argentina, Mexico, Costa Rica, Peru, and Guatemala participated in these strikes. The demands includes denunciation of the precariousness of the work, the end of arbitrary blockades, health protection during COVID, justice for those killed on the job, bonus for being considered an essential activity, and the option to reject demands without punishment. About what the workers in digital platforms think about their jobs, I would like to share with you some of the first findings of the survey I mentioned earlier, the Nexus of Uberization. As I said, in Latin America, we are interviewing app delivery workers in 3 Brazilian capitals outside the major economic center as Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, and in Córdoba, Argentina. It's about 100 participants. One of the first observations is about the histories of these workers. Both in Brazil and Argentina, at the same point in their lives, they have been in informal jobs. Some have experienced formal employment, but informality is a mark in their stories. They told us that the search for the job as a delivery worker by app occurred either because they saw it an opportunity to get higher incomes, or they were unemployment and they couldn't find other job opening, or it seems to be simple. Because you just put the app in the cell phone and then start to work, right? One of the most striking elements in this contradictory situation regards how they evaluate their jobs. The independence and the lack of a boss is something positively emphasized. This independence for them is represented by the possibility to choose their working hours and being able to make as much money as they want, since there is no time limit. It's important to consider, as observed by our Argentine colleagues, that the interviewees, they worked in an average of 10 hours a day to get the amount of money they need to survive. We just calculated in Brazil, in other countries, in this moment. Some of them even reject the idea of the digital platform worker tuning a formalized salaried job. The main resistance was considered that the salary they would obtain could be limiting according to their life demands. In addition, the remainder of the existence of immediate managers and bosses, typical for formal jobs, was something negative for them. Other than that, the inflexibility in schedules did not attract them to these modalities. At the same time, however, they denounced the authoritarianism with which the platform managed their work. Punishment and undue blocking with no rights to argumentation or discussion are pointed out as serious problems on the platform, mainly for not being able to access any person directly to dialogue or defend themselves. Moreover, at the same time, they also pointed out how the lack of financial security is an issue for them. If they get sick, have an accident, or something else, they have no support for the company. They also have no certainty about how much they will receive during the work week, since they depend on the rates and the amount of orders directly. The way in which these workers managed to deal with this lack of security was through solidarity. And this is an element that caught our attention. These workers told us how they often turn to each other to various kinds of support when they have a mechanical problems, are robbed, suffer accident, are improperly locked out, or even when they cannot work because they are sick. In the 1 year that we have been living with them, we have seen them get together to distribute basic baskets among themselves, to financially help the family of a delivery worker who has hospitalized, to publicly denounce clients who have cheated. I don't know if it happened here, but in this case, they go to the front of their house, these clients, and they sow a lot of noise in front of their house. And to rescue delivery workers' motorcycle that were stolen. In the interviewees' own words, they tell us how much they recognize this style of solidarity among them. To articulate these collective actions of solidarity, they use a permanent WhatsApp group. This is a very important element for the workers' dynamic because of the delivery workers, because it's also through these groups that they manage to mobilize politically. Although many of them say that they don't want any involvement with the political sphere, unions, or any kind of similar organization, this is a category that, at least in Brazil, has repeatedly held protests. These years, for example, they managed to organize in Brazil, one of the cities where the study takes place, a 2-day strike that managed to close all the restaurants registered in one of the platforms during this period. I remember McDonald's Natal say something, they lost 15,000 reais in these 2 days, only Natal. These are just some of the findings that have caught our attention and that we will dedicate ourselves in the coming months to systematically analyze what the delivery workers portrayed in their speech. However, we have already managed to think of some elements that seem relevant to the current debate around the issues of working on digital platforms. The first of these is with regard to its regulation. The public debate is polarized between the total assimilation of this type of work into formal salaried employment, mainly defended by traditional unions, and weak regulation, which only exempt the application company from their responsibilities for their workers, defended by the companies themselves. However, what we have been able to understand so far is that workers claim to have access to rights through this work. It's important to consider that when they reject traditional wage work, this speech carries all the history that I presented at the beginning of this speech. Wage work in Latin America is not necessarily synonymous with rights, since it's common for companies to avoid comply with legal agreements, nor is it good living condition, since salaries are structurally low, or much less dignity, since the slave heritage of violence as a management method remains within the labor relation in this region. Therefore, we can understand the rejection of workers, not necessarily to the regulation of this work, but that these elements of the traditional work are transported into the work by digital platforms. That is, these aversions speak much more about the situation of the super-exploited labor in Latin American countries than necessarily about the qualities of digital platform work. On the contrary, whether through the demonstration in the last 2 years, in the research we are conducting, or in the other study, what we see as one of the main issues for these workers in the total lack of regulation of this work. Here, apparently, regulation would need to go in 2 directions. The first is to guarantee access to social security for these workers, either by making sure that they receive a minimum income for their wages or financial support while they are unable to work. The second, by reducing the power of app companies to autocratically punish and fire their workers. A second point is about this issue of a freedom at work. For some, this could be the translation of the discourse of entrepreneurship or the neoliberal subject. But it is important to consider the multiple determination of this situation. Once again, in a context of precarious, super-exploited work, and with strong roots in the slave-like logic of labor management, objectively, there is little or no freedom in formal salaried work. Many of the reports obtaining in this and the other research study have shown how these workers have suffered humiliation in their work environments. Various forms of moral harassment, pressure from bosses to comply with schedules, no payment of overtime are some of the reports we heard. So effectively, there is some extra freedom in the work through a digital platform, even though it's not free work or fake freedom. Thus, what we observed is much less the convincing that these workers are entrepreneurs, but rather that they have more autonomy and freedom in this form of work. If, at the same time, it's necessary to problematize the romantic vision of this form of work, it is also fundamental to point out the need for formal work to be qualified, especially in this region of the world. A third point I would like to make is about the political role of solidarity among these workers. The Salvatorian author Martin Baró had already identified the power of solidarity among Latin American popular classes. For him, it has a political aspect of immediate survival, but also of organization of resistance to the logic of exploitation and the oppression to which these people have been historically subjected. I agree with him when looking at the case of app delivery workers in Brazil and Argentina. At the same time that they say they have no interest in formal political organization or institutional ones that already exist, they play the historical role that these organizations have. In the midst of solidarity they produce, they mature in their understanding of the injustice that the company platform subjected them to, and the absence of the states in offering any support. More than this, the same group in which these solidarity actions are fostered, included in the WhatsApp group, are also the ones that organize protests or political actions. Therefore, much more than remedying the absence of rights, there is a latent potential for these styles of combat the individualism and the competition typical of neoliberal ideology and restrains the bounds of struggle. So far, what we have been able to conclude is that at the same time that work through digital platform advances in Latin America, the process of a struggle of this category also advances in a contradictory way. Like other parts of the working class, there are ideology circulation among them that reproduce the status quo, but also that questions the exploitation they experience. The search of freedom, as already said, cannot be understood as the completely surrender to neoliberal ideology. This is a legitimated desire that has been present among the working class since the first moment that the bourgeoisie tried to completely submit labor to the reproduction of capital. It is not for another reason that the idea of free and the associated producer has been pointed out by socialism, or even as a transition in capitalism, the alternatives of association and cooperatives to rescue this freedom at work. It is true that in the late decades, the bourgeoisie has appropriated this discourse that present entrepreneurship as the way out the desire for freedom. However, our response as an academy and the political groups should not be to reject this demand. Rather, it should be to ideologically dispute the meaning of this freedom. The search for freedom linked to solidarity could be an opportunity context, an important context for the rescue of the historical banners for the surprise the exploitation relation that mark the current mode of production. I cannot conclude I cannot conclude my speech, especially when talking about solidarity process, organization, and political struggle without commenting on the atrocity that we are living at in this moment in my country, Brazil. After one of the dirtiest election we have ever experienced, the current Bolsonaro government announced on Thursday the suspension of payment of expenses related to the Ministry of Education. This means that at this time, in this moment, hundreds of thousands of researchers and the students are without their scholarships. Also, that public universities do not have the money to pay their basic bills, include outsourced employers, more workers without payment. All solidarity in form of struggle that the Bolsonaro government be held responsible for this atrocity, and that the financing of research and education in Brazil be resumed. So thank you, everybody.
Hi, everybody. I hope you enjoyed these talks as much as I did. I'm just going to offer a few comments, nothing elaborate, because I didn't have the chance to hear the presentations until you did. So just a few off the cuff comments. And I think we're really privileged to have a comparison here between New York and, well, Latin America. It's kind of a weird comparison, but because I do think, as I'll explain more in a minute, there's a lot of variation in how platform work plays out around the world. It's not the same everywhere. It's not the same in every industry. We already heard about the difference between Uber drivers and restaurant delivery workers. I've done some research on food delivery workers that I'll say a little bit about in a minute. They're all different. What's not different, I suppose, is the precarity of this kind of work or the exploitation involved. But my starting point in listening to all this is to point out simply that precarity and exploitation are hardly unique to platform work. They are part of contemporary capitalism in Latin America and here in the US. Like that's how it is, this is the world we live in right now and have been living in for some decades. It's true that this set of developments affects some workers more than others. It affects, in the case of the US, it affects immigrants, especially unauthorized immigrants, more than US born workers. It affects women more than men. It affects people of color disproportionately, etc. I think you all knew that before you walked in today. So platform work is sort of the new, it's not that new anymore, but the shiny object in the world of precarious labor, right? It's sort of, everybody's interested in it, including me, because it sort of seems like something different and new, and I think that's true for workers as well. However, it turns out it's not quite as unique as we might have begun to think, as I think these talks have shown. There's also a lot of debate about how big this sector is as a share of the workforce. The data from before the pandemic suggests that it was actually quite modest in size, at least in the US, maybe 2% of the total workforce, which is kind of, not very much. It's clearly expanded. I don't think maybe Andrew, I haven't seen any great data on like the moment that we're in right now. Obviously, this stuff exploded with the pandemic, so it's surely higher than it was before, but it's still not a huge part of the labor force. So let's just keep that in mind. I think you guys both sort of took for granted the discourse that's out there about this kind of work, about why it appeals to workers. But I want to say a little bit about that, because I think it's actually quite important in the story that the appeal is an illusion to a great extent, as you both showed. But why do people do this work at all? Especially like here in New York, where there's a huge labor shortage, it's not the only option. I'm sorry, it just isn't. Even for undocumented workers, there are jobs out there, but that what attracts people, at least initially, is the promise, a promise that's often false, of independence. I'm my own boss, right? Just deciding to do this when I want to. I have control over my time and so on. That's real. And I think we have to take that seriously. And it does set, again, it's an illusion to a great extent, although not 100% an illusion. It does set this work apart in a positive way from other forms of precarious labor, which are all around us. Think of like paid domestic labor, for example, or washing dishes in a restaurant, or working in retail, where you really have no control over your hours and they fluctuate from day to day, right? So none of this is unique. I think what's different here maybe is that there's this promise of something else. And as workers enter this part of the labor market, they discover that that promise is often observed in the breach rather than in its own fulfillment. But I want to know more about how this work compares to other kinds of informal labor, which is not a new phenomenon either in New York or the US more generally, but especially New York, or in Brazil or Argentina, right? I mean, we know that this is not a new thing. And I wonder, this is a question, I don't know the answer, but I wonder if the false promise that this work is better and different and, you know, shiny, and then the reality people confront might explain some of the organizing that you both described. Like I mean, this is an old-fashioned way of looking at protest, but often there's a gap between expectations and the reality one confronts that leads people to organize and protest. And so I think that may be part of what's happening here. Maybe we can talk about it more later. The protest itself, as you both showed, is also informal and precarious, one might say, that it doesn't take the form of conventional unions, which is, you couldn't really, in this country anyway, wouldn't really be an option given that these folks are classified or misclassified as independent contractors. But I suspect in Latin America, for the reasons you suggested, Felipe, that this is not it's not an appealing prospect. People are not attracted to traditional unionism. So I liked Andrew's pointing to the coercion consent sort of continuum, if you will. But again, I guess I think the consent is more important than you suggested. That people are actively embracing this work, even though they do end up very much disillusioned by it. So let me just tell you, I'm going to stop in a minute. I just want to say a little bit about a project I was involved in a couple years ago, pre-pandemic, about food delivery work. And it wasn't in New York, mostly it was in the rest of the country. Instacart, grocery delivery workers. Mostly that work is done, I believe now, as well as then, by women in cars. You had a few of those in your sample, I guess, but not by immigrant men on bicycles. They're mostly US-born women, because you have to drive a car. You either need to be a documented immigrant or born here. So, and what we found was very similar in some ways. That definitely what appealed to people was the promise of control over one's schedule and being your own boss thing. Like that has just, we did a lot of interviews with people who did this work, and they all talked about that. And especially the women, many of them had children, and they were able to do the work when their kids were in school or asleep or whatever, or when their husbands or partners were around to help take care of the kids. You know, this was a very appealing one. I remember vividly one interview where a woman had previously worked in a grocery store as a, employee in the old-fashioned kind of grocery store work, and then she heard about Instacart, and she said, "Why should I let some supervisor set my schedule when I can do this?" And she had no regrets about that part, because before she had a different schedule every week. Any of you who are familiar with retail know that that's how it works in this country, right? So she was not unhappy with that. She did have plenty of complaints, not only about the coercive features of the apps that Andrew described and you described too, but also she disliked the way she was treated by many of the customers as well. The apps, you didn't have anybody to talk to, it's true, they didn't like that. But she really appreciated many aspects of the job. She appreciated, and it wasn't just her, the ways in which her skills that had previously been unremunerated as somebody who knew how to do food shopping because she had done it for her family on an unpaid basis. And now she could make money from doing that. And not only that, but she was spending somebody else's money in the store. So they talked about that a lot. And they also liked the aspect that involved assisting people who needed help, that is disabled customers or old people or sick people who couldn't do their own grocery shopping. They felt there was like this, that was a very meaningful part of the job for them. In contrast, they hated the privileged customers who were just too lazy to do their own shopping and who treated them badly and often, didn't appreciate what they were doing. So it was a very mixed bag, all of which is just to say, I just think this stuff both varies a lot over the different sectors, the geography, the kinds of people who are doing it, and that we need to take seriously, especially in this moment of, I don't know if this is true in Latin America. Here in the US, there is a real labor shortage. People don't have to do this work, and yet they do. So we need to understand that better. Why is it attractive? Even if the disillusion that ensues over time is real and maybe also helps foment protest. So I think I'll just stop there, and I know you want to have a conversation so we can pursue some of this further in that format. Thanks.
So yeah, I want to know, maybe for the speakers to continue this conversation. We have half an hour, so we'll talk a little bit. There are many questions raised. I have a few too, but I also want to leave room for you to make questions if you want. I think this was such a fascinating conversation. So we still should use the microphone, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So should we use this one or both? Yeah.
Okay, so just for the sake of people who are watching us online.
They listen?
Yeah, I think both are supposed to be connected. Yeah. So I think we can maybe start, if you both want, addressing what Professor Wittmann just presented as central issues here. And it's funny because one of the words that I marked here was agency. And I think this is an important part of the narrative as well. And I was also thinking of another part of what I was thinking was this great resignation. So is it a privilege? How does this story that you both are telling is part of this moment that we're living in? How is it not? So if you can start.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I'll just kind of go through a few of the different things that Ruth said. Just in the order I took the notes. So in terms of is the gap between expectation and reality driving protest? I think it is to a degree, but one of the really key things that I saw in New York City, both with the deliveristas and with the Uber drivers, was the impact of the pandemic. People were really, immigrant workers were really angry that people kept calling them essential, but not giving them extra benefits. And I think that was really essential in galvanizing the deliveristas movement. So I wanted to, I guess these are kind of related. So I think the being your own boss thing is really important. And you talked about the Instacart workers and the impact of childcare. I saw that a lot as well in my interviews. And I think what's interesting is some of it gets to the gendering of immigrant work. So I found a lot of the men, so both the deliveries and the Uber drivers, often had female partners that had like a union job. And so it was like they were either janitors with 32BJ or nurses with or postal workers with, exactly. And so there was a sense that it was like the union job had to be protected. So the gig work appealed because unlike other service job, the men were often taking the emergency child care duty over, right? It was like they needed that. So I saw that in numerous cases, and during the pandemic, a lot of these men became the full-time caregivers because they weren't working and these women weren't. So I think the geography thing is really important. In addition to talking to Felipe about the differences, I've been working on a comparative project with a colleague in California where the institutional context as well as the geography really does change things. So as you're saying, like New York's really unique in this use of e-bikes to do this work. Elsewhere, it is almost all done in cars, except for a handful of other cities. And so one of the things that means as well is the workers toggle between working as like an Uber driver, taxi versus the food. So the work is very different in other places as well. To the why do they do this work? So I think the freedom thing is a really important point. I would say I think you see in New York City and some other places, it is a classic pattern of immigrant niche employment as well,
Sure.
Where when they arrive here, they're funneled into it by their communities. I kind of view I'm sure all of you see it, there's just e-bike service stores everywhere now, right? Like I kind of view this as during the gold rush, the only people that made money were the people who sold the axe picks, right? It's like, I feel like there's like a similar thing going on. So there's this whole like cottage industry popping up in these communities as well. So I think that's maybe my alternative explanation.
Cool. Do you want to answer that?
So about the agency, when finished to talk and they talk about the illusion of the shiny, right? The shiny jobs, and other things. I think maybe we have two illusions to deal in this moment, and I think the agency the center of the things. First, I think the academic and some political public illusion is about the formal work is the better and the unique form of work possible in this planet, as the exploitation work is the only way we could work, right? Is the one thing, because all how can I say, all proposals that was being during this time is change the platform work and the formal work as they are doing this all time. They work doing this all time. So it's the first illusion, because continuing being exploitation work, and what is in fact what the workers go away is from what is the formal work as a exploitation form of work, right? The way that someone tell you what you have to do without you participating in this decision. We got less money than you deserve for your job. You produce a lot of more than you get in turn for this. So I think it's the first illusion, because in our debates we don't put the other ways of work, right? Or put the main question is all jobs is exploitation work, and in some way the workers in general want to be free to do what they want, or together with the other colleagues, and discuss what we will have to do, what the better way to this work. And then there is a long tradition in work psychology that shows this. What the freedom of the work, what the autonomy to decide what we do in my activity, how it's important for the health of the individual, but in the general for the society too. I think this is the first illusion. The second is what the Ruth said, because as the other works is so precarious, and if you saw what the people doing these jobs is in the hierarchy of the working class, is the people that has access to the worst job possible, or informality jobs, or jobs that you will get some violence in job, arrestments, and the other things. So it could be an illusion too, because as I said, in general, the workers want to be free, want to do realize in this job, or feel that I'm doing what I want to do. I'm developing as a subject in my work. So when you see a new way to work, as in the platform, I think this the shine that the people go, and then and then the people arrives. Yeah, there is a lot of things have to change. It's a big problem because it's a small part of the working class. And today, I think in Latin America, and it's about 10%. It's not so huge compared to the other, but it could be expanded, right? I remember when I interviewed the workers in Natal in Brazil, they said when they start this job, is easy entering the platform, but now you have to wait 1 year, 2 years to enter this platform. So this number could grow more and more in the next week, in the next year. So remember what I'm saying because I'm got lost now. But what I'm saying is when they arrive there, there is this lot of things have to do. But compare, and I'm talking in Brazil. I don't know here because, as you said, here there's more job opportunity here, right? But in Brazil and in Argentina, when they arrive, they found a place with one other things better than compared to the other jobs. The key of humiliation is so important because I did another research with informal workers that left the formal job to enter in the informal job, and what they say about the past jobs is terrible. It's like just don't get physical violence because the other violence they have. They say, oh, this month I sell, I don't know, 1,000 or something like that, but my boss don't pay my check at the end of the day. I see the money enter, but they don't pay me, and when I need, they don't pay me the extra time that I spend here, or they yell with me, or do so violent environment that I want to go to the other place. Even this place, I don't have the security that I have in the formal job. So I think we have the debate of the digital platform work is a debate about the work in these days in general. It's not just the digital platform. There is a author in Brazil called Ludmila Bilio, and she said something when we talk about the regulation of digital platform work, in some way we try to naturalize this way of work, right? And it's complete. It's hard because it's a work that you don't have security. In no way do you have security. But at the same time, we have to discuss about the work in general because it's a photographic or the picture of the precarious in these days, right? It's not just for 50% of working class or 10%, but talk about the all precarious that we live today.
Lucy, you want to add to that? Well, just a couple things. Yeah, I mean, I think that Andy's point about the pandemic helping to stimulate protest is really important. I totally agree with that. And we all know this, that it's not just platform workers, but we've seen a sort of explosion is probably an exaggeration, but an increase, an upsurge of labor activity more generally among very different kinds of workers from these, right? You know, I mean, I'm thinking of the Starbucks, the Amazon, the Apples, all that stuff. Completely different demographic than the people we're talking about today. These are mostly US born and college educated actually workers in most of those settings, but we are seeing a renewed critique of capitalism more broadly. But you know, this is capitalism. Exploitation is what work is all about under capitalism. We should know this by now. Like, so there's nothing special about platform work in that regard, right? This is the way the world works for nowadays. But I think the pandemic has highlighted the injustices that involves more than before and has made people less willing to endure it. So that I think is huge. But it's not limited to platform work. That's a broader phenomenon. I just want to say one other thing, which maybe people already know, but in our project, we came across this. So these jobs were when platform work first took off, it did pay better. I think your data showed this because the companies had to attract a workforce. So they offered pretty good deals to people initially. Once they had a kind of captive workforce, it ratcheted down. I think your data showed this very explicitly. So that's just part of how it all has unfolded. Like not because of the pandemic or anything. That's how they recruit people, and then they make it worse. Just one other tiny point. When we started our project, which is about food delivery, we came across these various commentator, texts about food delivery work, and they claimed, this is way before the pandemic, that something like 80% of all food delivery work in the United States was in New York City, actually in Manhattan. so that's obviously no longer true. but at the beginning of this industry, that is, in this city, there's a long tradition of stuff getting delivered, not on a platform, but people delivered from restaurants or things. And so now it's become this global phenomenon. So, so that's just an interesting angle too, in terms of how it varies. And people here in Manhattan, especially, maybe not in Brownsville, where your example on the slide, are long used to having stuff show up at their doorstep, right? That's not new. So anyway, that's all. So this is old wine in new bottles, I guess is my main point. Once again,
there's a lot to unpack, I think, from this conversation. First, I wanted to build just call attention for the women's role in your narrative, that they are normally married to women who are unionized. And I was wondering the connections that this could have with your previous work on women as auxiliary in males unions and all that. I think it's a fascinating topic that I had no idea of. So I just think it's striking. I'm also wondering, because Fellipe said so much about this being a work thing and a systemic and an institutionalized issue, I'm also thinking about that in terms of immigration legislation in this country and how much we learn to prioritize qualified immigrants. And I'm a beneficiary of that. My green card is one of my extraordinary abilities, and I'm so embarrassed for that, especially when the pandemic hit, because I felt like I'm not offering anything, and all of these people who cannot. And I was explaining to many of my friends, why can't they? Because they can't. Because that's how the system is built. That's how legislation is built in this country. And there's no conversation about that. There's just a clapping in the windows, but not about addressing the systematic exploitation. I also wonder, and I took note of that, to what extent this is different or not. But I'm also intrigued by the fact that there are some elements there. For instance, at first I was like, yeah, the app thing is nothing different from anything else when you were talking, and I said, especially because there are examples such as WhatsApp being a tool of resistance somehow, and of union organization and all those aspects of another app that is actually making, and that also worked for undocumented immigrants, by the way. WhatsApp was a very important force of organization and sharing news, real news instead of fake news and everything. But the algorithm, though, for me, was the part of the equation that I felt like this is another level of exploitation, and maybe a very unique level of exploitation. And I'm thinking of the algorithm in terms of labor, and in many instances, like Instagram revamps its algorithm, and influencers who we don't really care and think of as laborers, but have to reshape the way they're working. And instead of producing one video a day, they have to now produce 5 because the algorithm is making them work harder or more, and it doesn't care about quality or anything. You have to do more and more and more and more to make less. So I'm wondering to what extent the algorithm could be the new element that makes this particular labor different or unique in terms of the broader narrative of work.
Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's I think it weaponizes a lot of processes that existed before. And I think what's interesting about it and others have done this research as well, is automation actually stands to get rid of more white collar jobs, right? So the algorithm's replacing a manager, right? It's not replacing the physical labor that's still needed of the lowest paid workers. But what I was actually, this isn't my own idea, I was just reading this, someone writing about Amazon. The other interesting thing that the algorithms do about the workers is it makes the workers complicit in the algorithm's continued information gathering system. So the workers are generating info constantly that are informing how the algorithms then work in turn, right? Whereas in the past, often the workers' specialized knowledge of how the system really worked, right, was often part of what they could kind of use as their resistance. Like strikes are more effective if the workers have specialized knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's another kind of overlooked process to it, and there's been some discussion around that as well, in terms of like, especially in the EU, about should the workers also get control their own data, or at least get a copy of it, so to speak, et cetera. So those are the things that immediately come to mind in response to the
Oh, okay, I'll just mention one thing, which some of you probably know this book, Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, which is kind of what you're talking about. That's the, I don't know if it's unique exactly, but the special feature of algorithmic management. It's not, I also did another project which we never published because the pandemic kind of overwhelmed it, but involving Amazon delivery workers. Right around the corner on 35th Street, you might notice that there's a bunch of them there every day. Now they're everywhere, but in the beginning, when we did this, they were just there. And what we discovered in that project was that a lot of the workers were formerly incarcerated. They weren't immigrants. They were Black and brown men, mostly born in the US, but they had, many of them, been in prison not long before. And they said things like, oh, I really like working outside. I really like that my supervisor is the app, not, because that uses an app too, not a person, right? Can you imagine? So, I mean, it's complicated, right? These things are not straightforward. On the gender thing, I was really interested in the fact that 25% of your New York deliveries were women. That I didn't know that. That's a high number because, our stereotype is that this is a man, a Black or brown man from another country on an e-bike, right? Clearly, it's more. Even within New York, it's more varied than that. So that's fascinating. But, do you want to respond to that? And then?
Yeah. So two things about that actually. So first, I wanted to be clear about the marriage thing that I said earlier. That mainly applied to the taxi drivers. That was most of the deliveristas are single men. But yeah, there are a ton of women who do the work. But I was surprised. That was the city's data that really got that, because again, they had access to actual lists of workers, where we just went to crowded areas and did a survey.
Maybe it was the so-called outer boroughs where cars are more.
This is when I see it. So I've been a little coy about this, but as part of my research, I did work the apps, and when I would see the women working, it was never in Manhattan. It was always in the outer boroughs. And the women worked in cars, and they often worked in kind of pairs. As like I spoke to this one woman who she was like, well, if my girlfriend and I are just going to sit on the stoop and talk, we should just sit in my car and talk, and I'll make money. Right. And so I see a lot more people in the outer boroughs in cars.
So it's more like the rest of the country.
Yes.
Yeah.
So about the woman issues that you said, in the research in Brazil and Argentina, we just go to the street and try to interview the people. We didn't find the women. Wow. And it is quite interesting because we talk about a work that you just put in your cell phone and start to do this job, right? So we didn't find, and we think we have cultural difference here and in Brazil and in Argentina. And sometimes when I'm as a customer, right, when an Uber driver or something, and I met a woman driver, and I asked, oh, so what's the problem? And every time she said, or they said, The problem is the margin. Yeah, sexual harassment and other thing. And I think it's maybe more dangerous when you work as a delivery worker and you go to everywhere and then every time we go alone just in a motorcycle. So it's really dangerous. But here I had the opportunity to interview 2 or 3 women and it was really interesting. What they said is it's completely different what the man says, but it's just 3, all right? So I think it's interesting. About the algorithm management, we have some discussions in Brazil about this because, all right, in this moment, it happens in the delivery workers and the Uber drivers or the drivers by platform, but it could be a lab for this expand for another type of work too. I think maybe there were 4 years in São Paulo. There is a proposal for Doria government to do a kind of platform work for teachers in the city, but that didn't happen. All right, I don't know what happened, but it's not happened in the end of the day. But these ideas happen now. You have it in the health professionals. It happen now. We could use the platform to do this, and the algorithmic management in this context too. And it could be expanded for our jobs. I don't know in the other professors you have this like the system when you have to put the notes of the grades, they have to put everything. You could manage by this system too. So what we think now in the delivery work and the driver work in general, we have this type of management, but it could be expanded for the other areas too. Maybe in the next years, if the workers doesn't resist for these things, all right? So in that one last question that I wanted to talk about is when we talk the exploitation capitalism in general, so this way, right? So interesting because we have, I think, mainly the protest is for a regulation in this job, this type of work, but we have it mainly in Europe and Brazil, we have some workers try to organize co-ops and a way to skip for the companies of the digital platforms and skip for the formal jobs too. So try organize other ways to work and get this freedom that they want before this jobs too.
That's fascinating. I hope the platform for us doesn't make us grade more and more and more to be paid more and more and more. So I just wanted to open to the audience. If you want to make any questions, maybe feel free to do so. We can take the microphone to you. Anyone?
I was wondering, because Fellipe and Andrew talked about social movements and types of mobilizations by the liberistas. I love that name. And I was wondering, and Fellipe talked about the Paro Internacional e Break dos Apps, and Andrew talked about the Workers' Justice Project, and it felt like they are kind of supporting the deliveristas in some political organizations. I was wondering if there is any kind, how does these workers talk to each other, especially in these international flows and international kinds of mobilizations and organizations, you know, within Latin America, and is there any kinds of conversations between American workers and Latin American ones? That's it. Thank you.
I don't know, whoever.
Right, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. So quickly to clarify, so the Los Deliveristas Unidos began as a WhatsApp group, and then the guys that had started that WhatsApp group got connected to Workplace Justice Project, who took on their cause. So they're like the same organization. They're actually in the process, as great as the name is, they're rebranding to make it clear to the other immigrants that it's not just for Latinos. And they've been doing a tremendous amount of organizing, especially the Bangladeshi community. There's actually a surprising amount of international dialogue. They have frequent calls with people across the country, world. And then the other thing I see a lot too is a lot of people organize in both countries. So the real activists, they organize these workers when they go home for a few months and then they're back here. So you see a lot of that as well.
Interesting, because there is a paper that's trying to describe how they organize it, how they try to organize the Paro Internacional and the requisites, and the communication is between these informal groups. But these informal groups actually have names, all right? They don't use the union's names. They don't try to formalize as a unions. But they exist. They exist and they have names. And now in São Paulo we have the entregadores antifascistas, like the deliverers antifascistas, something like that. Delivery workers antifascistas, something like that. And these groups try to contact one another. And in this case of the Paro Internacional, they started in 5 countries, and every edition is expanded because they send the letter, send the proposal for the other groups that they know. I don't know how they know each other, maybe by internet, or maybe the one workers know about this and the telephone and others. But what we have is the last edition of this Paro Internacional have like 8 countries involved in this. It's important to know in Brazil, I think the center of these organizations is São Paulo, maybe Rio de Janeiro, but in the other places we don't have these organizations so strong compared to these other centers. When I came to New York, I'm talking with a group, an informal group in Natal, and they organize themselves. And it's interesting. But what I think interesting, and they got to do these strikes and other things. But at the same time, I think the companies pay attention to these mobilizations, and they try to build some weapons to deal with this organization. In that moment, one of the biggest companies in Brazil tried to get together these workers and talk with them and try some seduction, let's say this way, right? Because it's not an improve of the work, but a seduction. That, we could talk, let's do event here, come on, and have drinks and other things. And try to seduce these workers to not organize it in a strong way or organize it together with the company, right? So just let's open another dialogue here or something like that, right? I think the companies is really smart, and see what happened now in this moment about this organization in some way.
Yeah. So thank you all so much for coming. If you have other questions, including people who are watching us online, just send them to us and we'll make sure to deliver them to all the participants here. Andrew Wolf, thank you so much. Ruth Milkman, Fellipe Coelho-Lima, thank you all so much for this amazing and insightful conversation. We appreciate you. Thank you all for coming.